Thanks for joining us for another Miistakis Monday. Today, we're going to be talking about Calgary Captured, a multi-year wildlife monitoring and citizen science project. My name is Nicole Kahal, and I work with the Miistakis Institute. If anyone here is not familiar with us, we are a not-for-profit charitable applied conservation organization affiliated with Mount Royal University. And you'll also be hearing today from Lynette Hiebert, who is a parks ecologist with the City of Calgary Urban Parks Landscape Analysis. Before we get started, I just want to go over a quick few things about the Zoom today. Everyone's going to be muted and you'll stay that way. So please use the chat box for questions and make sure that all panelists and attendees are selected so that everybody could hear you. Feel free to write your questions as we go. And then once Lynette and I are finished with our presentations, then we will address all of the questions. And then before I begin, I just want to acknowledge our great group of partners and funders that make this project possible. The Miistakis Institute, City of Calgary, Alberta Parks, Friends of Fish Creek, and the Weaselhead Glenmore Park Preservation Society. We think it's a really strong group because we have some decision makers and community groups, all of whom will be utilizing this information, helping with project direction and engagement. And then, of course, we have our generous supporters, our funders, Alberta Eco Trust, TD Friends of the Environment Foundation, and the Calgary Foundation. Thanks so much for the support. The project would not be possible without them. So today, I'll just go over a quick overview about what I'll be talking about. I'm going to be going over the program objectives, and then through that, you'll hear a bit about our camera trap methodology and our citizen science component, so you'll learn how you can get involved. And a few of the lessons learned, we've had many, so I'll just go over a couple of the unique ones. And then a quick update on what's next before passing it off to Lynette, who will give you a bit of a view of this project from the city's perspective. So Calgary Captured is a multi-year wildlife monitoring project. We launched in 2017, and it also has a citizen science component. So when we started, we determined our three main objectives. The first is to determine which species occur in Calgary and where. This might seem like some basic information, but it's actually a data gap. We do not have scientifically collected, systematically collected data on what wildlife occurs in Calgary and where. And this information is really important because it can help to inform management and development decisions in Calgary. And our second was to gain a better understanding of how animals move around and respond to our urban environment, which is a bit trickier, but I'll be talking about that in a moment. And the third, to engage Calgarians in urban wildlife. So to answer what species occur in Calgary and where, we utilize camera traps. Camera traps are pretty widely used in wildlife research programs, and they're very efficient and non-invasive tools to better understand wildlife in an area. Our cameras use a passive infrared motion sensor that detects motion moving past the camera. So that's a person, an animal, or even an object moving past the camera, grass waving in the wind, that triggers the camera to take a photo. We have ours to take set to take a series of 3 photos in a row so that we can capture anything that's moving quickly by. We strap these cameras to trees and point them at game trails or even human trails to capture wildlife movement through these trails. Wildlife, tend to use the same trails we use. You can see in this photo on the left, that's my colleague Sarah setting up one of the cameras with her dog Charlie. And the photo on the right shows a camera that's already attached to a tree. It's a bit higher than we normally place it, but it just kind of shows how well camouflaged it is. So it is non-invasive. It does not bother the animals. Sometimes we think that deer can hear maybe the slight trigger of the camera, but they do not have a big white flash. They have an infrared nighttime flash that allows them to capture images at night as well. So this is a map of Calgary. To orient yourself, the bigger yellow blob at the top is Nose Hill. You can kind of make out the curve of the Bow River in downtown Calgary with the lines depicting the roads, and down to the south, the Y of Fish Creek Provincial Park. So everywhere in yellow on this map, we have cameras set up. We have 69 cameras located across Calgary. We tried to get a good distribution across the entire city, but as you can tell, the northeast of Calgary just doesn't have that many parks. We don't have that many large natural environment parks in that area. And we chose to place cameras in parks that were over 25 hectares in size, or some of the smaller natural environment parks that acted as connections to some of the larger parks. And this grid that's overlaying this map helped us to ensure that cameras were systematically placed in each park. So that roughly every grid gets a camera. And then of course, moved around a bit to ensure that it's on a trail that can capture wildlife. I chose to include these photos because I thought that they highlighted a couple unique things about this project. The first being that it gives us a really unique perspective into wildlife in our urban area. You see the bottom images, the fawn nursing and the little band of raccoons. These are things that we don't normally see when we're out enjoying our Calgary parks. And then the top two, the cougar and the moose, just think about how big these animals are and how incredible it is that they can even navigate Calgary with all of the, high traffic volume roads and dense communities and concrete. It's incredible that we have wildlife in Calgary and they continue to live and move through this urban environment. So this brings us to objective 2. How do animals move around the built environment? I think this photo is pretty neat. It shows a mule deer with the Calgary skyline in the background. It's a bit blurry, but that little red dot is the Calgary Tower. And so this objective is a bit trickier. There are limitations to camera traps. We don't have all of our animals collared. We can't see exactly how they're moving around the environment, but there's a couple things we can do utilizing camera traps. And one is that we can place them in wildlife corridors, which are areas that animals use to move through to access habitat. So by placing a camera in some of these smaller natural areas that we think are acting as corridors, we can just validate that they are in fact using those areas, and that can help the city prioritize which areas that they might want to naturalize or restore so that they can be fully utilized by animals. And then the second is we can explore if we see any difference in animal detection before and after development. So we have a camera located in an area that's adjacent to an area slated for development. We can see if that development had any impact on maybe the types and numbers of species that we're seeing on that camera. And our third objective is to engage Calgarians. We have a few main key messages, and the first is that nature does exist, even in our large urban areas. You don't have to drive out to the mountains to be in nature. It's around us all the time, and that we can peacefully coexist with wildlife in Calgary. And the third is that we need to support efforts to maintain wildlife if we want to continue to see them here. I think a lot of people in Calgary enjoy seeing wildlife and enjoy that wildlife can live in Calgary, but we need to support cities' efforts to invest in wildlife management to sustain their populations. This could be pushing for development to even consider that wildlife needs to live and move around these spaces, or even things like animal-friendly development that helps animals get over or under roads, or even fencing to keep them off certain roads or out of areas that won't be conducive to animal presence. And so to meet this engagement objectives, we are utilizing citizen science. And if you're not familiar with citizen science, these are projects that partner researchers with community members. And these projects have both science goals to gather data and engagement goals. And so we are using citizen scientists to help classify the species that are found in the images that our cameras capture. And we are doing this through the Zooniverse platform. If you aren't familiar with Zooniverse, it's a really neat website. It has global presence, and it's a crowdsourcing platform for citizen science. There's all sorts of neat projects on there. And so we host a Calgary Captured page. And so this can be done from your own home, from any computer, and it offers a really great social distancing activity. So I encourage you to check it out. The top of this slide has the Zooniverse link, but of course you can go to just zooniverse.org and search for Calgary Captured. You'll find our project page there. And you do not need an account to participate, but if you do have an account, it allows you to save images and interact with us and other participants, ask questions about certain images or the project and that sort of thing. It's really created a sort of online community. It's been pretty neat. And so you also don't need to be an expert to help classify the images. It has on the right-hand side, it lists all of the Canadian species that we might see in Calgary. And if you clicked on one of them, say I clicked on bobcat, it pops this up over to the right-hand side and your image will still stay up on the left. And then it gives you some photos and some information on how to identify that species. And there's also a field guide that further helps you with that. I'll go back up to this last page. And you might also notice when you participate that there is no option to choose unknown. I get a lot of questions about that. And that is basically because we are trying to force a participant to make their best guess. There will definitely be some images that you cannot classify. It might be a nighttime image, and so it might be really blurry, or it might just be the back of a deer or unknown animal, a leg. It might just, might be hard, but just again, make your best guess. And we do this because Zooniverse has undertaken a study that basically showed if you include an unknown option, the majority of people will pick that, and then you'll have a lot of images that have an unknown classification that will then need to be go through individually. And so to help with that, we have 8 different people classify a single image. So that's our quality control component. So you don't need to worry too much because 7 other people will be looking at that same photo and making their best guess. And chances are, if it's impossible to identify, everybody's going to pick something different. Because if all 8 people don't agree on what species is in that image, it gets flagged for our review. So now I'm going to just move on to some of our lessons learned. This first is just that the trees that we strap our camera to are also beaver food. And that cows will also chew down our cameras. There's one park in Calgary that has cattle grazing on it once a year. And every year I try to move the cameras up high or wrap the straps really tight around the tree. Every year the cows get the straps loose and drag the cameras to the ground. And so we have tens of thousands of images from the ground's perspective of cows wandering about. And then another is that Calgary is really cold. This is in November. And so this just drives the point home that we must use high quality lithium batteries. And also we need lock deicers. The lock deicer was actually something that some of our volunteers figured out. We have a group of Friends of Fish Creek volunteers, we call them the camera crew, that are very dedicated volunteers that go year round to maintain the cameras in Fish Creek Park. We have about 18 there. And we do check our cameras every 4 to 6 weeks, mainly because we are in an urban environment and they do get stolen. And so if they do get stolen, we don't want to lose months and months of data. So we do check them more often than we need to, because these cameras can usually last about a year just on their batteries alone. And so this is a big one, is that there's a big time lag to the data. So you can imagine there is a time lag between when an image is actually taken on a camera and when a clean data set is available. So there is the time needed to actually visit the camera to physically collect the SD cards that holds the image. But then we need to sort through those images to record the human use, because we're interested in human use as well as wildlife use. But then we need to delete those human images because we don't want those making it to the public Zooniverse site for privacy reasons. So that had previously taken a very long time. But luckily, about 6 months ago, the City of Calgary's corporate analytics and innovation team created a machine learning model that auto tags all of our images as either having humans in it, as being blank, which would just maybe a vegetation triggered the camera or an animal already moved by, and then basically everything else, which we would presume is wildlife. And that enables us to automatically have those all sorted. And then we can just take that everything else folder, that wildlife folder, and put it up onto Zooniverse, which has been great. But Zooniverse itself does take a while, mainly because each image has to be classified 8 times. But we think that's necessary for quality control. And then, of course, the time needed after citizen scientists are done reviewing the data, we just need a quick expert review of those classifications. And so that brings me to what's next. We just keep in mind that we did launch this program in 2017, and this year we finally have a full year of data cleaned because of that time lag I just mentioned. So we'll have that available this summer, and we will definitely be sharing some summary statistics from the parks. But because we've been able to catch up, we will have 3 years by the end of this year on which we will be doing a more robust analysis and sharing our results. So stay tuned. And then we are continuing to gauge Calgarians through citizen science on Zooniverse. So I encourage you to check it out. We also have some engagement materials that we're going to be releasing soon. And then, of course, our community group partners have some ongoing volunteer programs and some education programs planned that incorporate some of the same messaging from this project. So thanks so much for that quick overview of Calgary Captured. Again, there's the link to Zooniverse down there. Check it out. There's a bit of information on there. You can check out the talk section where people have saved some cool photos. And then here's my email if you have any questions. And before I pass it off to Lynette, I just want to let everybody know that this webinar and all previous Miistakis Monday webinars are posted onto our website. So rockies.ca, you can visit this link. They're all in our resource library. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Lynette, you can take over.
Can everybody hear me? If somebody could just comment and let me know, that would be fantastic. All right, thanks everybody. So as Nicole mentioned, my name is Lynette Hiebert. I work with the City of Calgary in their Parks Department with a group called Urban Conservation, and I manage the Calgary Captured program for the City of Calgary. So for those of you who aren't familiar with, oh, sorry. Oh, I see, it's a question. My apologies. For those of you who aren't familiar with urban conservation, it's not too complicated. It's exactly what it sounds like. We work in all areas of conservation within the City of Calgary. So that might go from identifying and advocating for the retention of ecologically significant areas in new developments to wetland riparian and terrestrial restoration, or to do what I do in my group, gather data, analyze it, and use it to inform those conservation activities. And today, I hope that I can give you a little bit of an overview of the importance of the Calgary Captured program to the City of Calgary and how we hope to use the data that we're going to gain from it. Okay, so my apologies, but as I work for the city, we're going to start with a little bit of policy. So much of what we do in urban conservation is guided by our policy, and our guiding policy document is the biodiversity strategy and the biodiversity policy that's associated with it. And so it sets out broad direction for our commitment to biodiversity and ecosystem stewardship in the city. We've made a commitment that by 2025, we will evaluate landscapes in Calgary and set targets for conservation measures to identify, protect, and manage our ecological cores and corridors, and to restore 20% of the city's current open space. So within that, there's a series of commitments, but there are two in particular that you see on your screen right now that I think are directly relevant to Calgary.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I don't see your screen. I don't know if you're not sharing one yet.
I am sharing. Can you see it now?
No. Looks like
No.
somebody's, oh, no.
Oh. What about this? How about now?
Yes, great.
Okay, sorry everyone. I thought it was sharing, but I missed that. Okay. Excellent. So the two commitments that sort of I think are directly relevant to Calgary Captured is the first one is fostering ecological literacy for our citizens. So that's promoting awareness of biodiversity and providing meaningful stewardship opportunities. And the second one is a commitment to improve the City of Calgary's ecological resilience. And so that looks like maintaining or increasing our ecological connectivity, restoring our terrestrial, riparian, and wetland habitats, and also managing invasive species. And the city's participation in Calgary Captured is one of the many ways that we can meet these commitments that we have in our policy documents. So I'm going to dive into the citizen eco-literacy piece first. Calgary Captured is the city's first foray into a citizen science project. And as Nicole mentioned, the program offers a really unique stewardship opportunity for citizens. It involves looking at these remote camera images and classifying the species they see using the resources on the website. So the process isn't particularly onerous to the citizen. As she mentioned, they can participate from home fairly easily, and the methodology is not too technical or complicated. And the role for citizens is a meaningful one because they're making a significant contribution by participating in this critical step of the data classification process. So in order to be able to do that, they either need to be familiar with the wildlife species in the city or use the resources available on the platform to learn about them. So in that act of classifying the data, the participants are either reinforcing their existing knowledge, in some cases they're offering that assistance and knowledge to other users on the site, or they're learning about the diversity of wildlife that call Calgary home. So this program is a way for citizens to be able to experience nature even though they're not actually out in it. And as Nicole mentioned, it's particularly good right now while we're all practicing some physical distancing. And it's a good way to have them understand as well that they're actually already coexisting with this wildlife, which I think is an important message. So in providing these stewardship opportunities at the city, we want to be able to engage whether or not we're actually meeting those program goals, monitor for progress, and ensure that any hiccups are dealt with. And so we can do that by looking at our participation as a metric for determining if we're actually engaging citizens in that way. So we can take a look at the number of participants, and this is just a couple of photos from the landing page on Zooniverse, which gives you an up-to-date look at the volunteers, the number of classifications, the progress. So right now we're at about 3,840, and with this new batch of images that we've just uploaded, we're getting about 3,000 classifications a day, so that's really excellent participation. So we can also get a sense of how much participants are interacting with one another, or we have the ability to engage with them and monitor real time, address any issues through the talk section. And there's just a little, we do get talk statistics as well, so we can see how much conversation is being generated on a regular basis. So we can get a better sense of how many citizen scientists are actually Calgarians by examining participant location details. As Zooniverse is able to provide that information to us via the location of the IP addresses of site visits. So that's what we're looking at now. And these stats aren't up to date. They're actually from 2019, summer of 2019. We're waiting on getting a fresh batch now. But you can see that about 77% of participants are from Canada. And when we drill down into that a little bit more, we actually have about 63% of participants from Calgary directly, so that we can confirm that we are actually engaging Calgarians and helping them understand their biodiversity better. So we know that citizen science can enrich our connection to nature, improve our knowledge of local species and issues, and improve participants' ecological literacy. And we've seen this demonstrated in the first season of Calgary Captured. We're really happy to see it continuing. Participants have fallen in love with Bucky, who you are looking at right now. He's a local resident mule deer who likes to strike ridiculous poses for the camera. But This is the camera that he most appears in. A song dog or a coyote, which I'm trying to pop up there, yeah, appeared on Bucky's stage and sparked some conversation on the website from a new volunteer who was unclear what the significance of Bucky's stage was or what the term song dog was. But some of the more avid and regular volunteers responded with explanations. So this example, I think, is a really good illustration that our citizen scientists are developing a narrative around the regulars, which highlights a familiarity with sites, the species and individuals that occupy those sites. And we've seen some very dedicated volunteers also emerging as leaders within that community. They provide guidance and assist one another. And we've seen this behavior continue on into our third season of data, which I think is a really good indicator that we're continuing to provide engaging biodiversity stewardship opportunities for Calgarians. So I'm going to move into the ecological resilience piece. That was the second commitment that I introduced on that first slide there. And so what does ecological resilience actually look like? It can take the form of protection or conservation of prime natural spaces through development or planning. And the other big way that we can affect it at the city is through the management practices in our existing parks. So that may include naturalization or habitat restoration. Traditionally, biodiversity conservation focuses on setting aside protected lands, but in an urban setting, we don't necessarily have those same opportunities. So we need to look more closely at how we strategically manage our cores and corridors to ensure that those prime habitats are being connected. And in order to be able to do this well, we need to collect more information on how well our cores and corridors are functioning in Calgary. And this particularly is where Calgary Captured comes in and provides really valuable data because it addresses an existing gap in our current data set. So Calgary has been collecting wildlife sightings and roadkill reports for about 13 years now. And we do that either through 311 reports or road crews or police reports with vehicle wildlife collisions. So we've been using that data for broad trend analysis to better understand the species we have in Calgary, where they're making use of the city, or like this map shows, where they might not be making the best use of it, where they may have some challenges for movement. So the red areas are high collision areas that you can see on your screen there. So this next map, we do have some challenges with this crowdsourced data, and you may be able to tell it already, tell what it is already. But the map this shows our 311 deer observations over about a 9-year period. But if you take a look at our large natural areas, there's no reported observations in Nose Hill Park, Glenmore Weasel Head, or Griffiths Woods. And the reason for that is 311 wildlife reports are tethered to an address, which typically occurs on the perimeter. So even if you report a sighting from the center of Nose Hill Park, for example, the way the data is recorded is such that that data point is inaccurate. So we have a bit of an accuracy problem there. And the 311 reports are also unverified. So people may not know exactly what species they're looking at. There's no resources for them to tell it. And we do, in fact, actually have one report of an alligator in our 311 data set. However, the picture that I just popped up there is not from Calgary. I am happy to report it is actually from Montreal, the alligator crossing the road. So data from Calgary Captured can help fill that gap that I mentioned. So if you recall Nicole's slide with the parks, or with the map with all the parks in it, that's where we have all the cameras. So those cameras give us verified species records inside Calgary's large natural area parks. But as she also mentioned, due to the time it takes to classify those images using the Zooniverse platform, there's that notable delay from the time the image is taken to the time that we can analyze the data. So like she said, we're close to having a full year's worth of data to start analyzing. And the data analysis that we'd like to perform is taking a look at seasonal and temporal wildlife patterns for different species within the city. We'd like to take a look at the impact of human presence on wildlife, and where appropriate, if we can, we may explore some occupancy modeling for larger parks. And we're trying to answer a few specific questions. And one of them is, who calls Calgary home? So while we can't directly measure populations from the data on our camera, we can get a sense of the wildlife that calls Calgary home. I was scrolling through a couple of different images of the different species that we've seen show up on our cameras. So this is a quick snapshot of the species detected in the first and second season's worth of data. We captured a flying squirrel in season 1, and then in season 2, some of the notable ones were black bear, cougar, and marten. And as you can see, we don't always see the same species showing up from season to season on the same cameras. So another question we're interested in is, where are they in the city? Finding out where certain species are most likely to spend time allows us to tailor and target our conservation and management efforts. So the maps that you're looking on screen right now, on the left-hand side is the 311 data for bobcat sightings for about a 10-year period. And then the map on the right is the first season of cameras that had detected bobcat on them. So for bobcat, we might not expect that we would find it living in the interior of the city. However, the bobcat seems to be making a relatively decent living in urban habitats. And in this case, the Calgary Captured camera data supports the voluntary sightings called into 311. We're seeing animals in those hotspot areas on the cameras in those same areas. And here's another example of where we might be seeing them. And this is a moose example. So data from the cameras didn't correspond very well with our 311 sightings data in the case of the moose from the first season. In 10 years of reported moose sightings to 311, the majority of them are sighted up in that northwest corner of the city in the Tuscany-Simons Valley area, the occasional visitor to Weaselhead Park. However, camera monitoring showed a lot more moose activity at Weaselhead Glenmore. We actually even had one visitor all the way out on the east side of the city in Ralph Klein in season 1. However, we did not see that repeated in season 2. So another question we're interested in asking is, how do species live with one another? By evaluating our camera images, we can begin to better understand the Calgary urban ecosystem, including species interactions. So this data will help us understand species behavior, how species might compete with one another or engage in predator-prey dynamics or avoid each other. And so we're also very interested in, how can humans and wildlife coexist? We know that people can change the way that wildlife behave, and some of the animals adapt well to humans while some are indifferent and some avoid us. The camera data will allow us to better understand our impact on wildlife. And then we can, for example, apply that understanding and that information to assist with managing users and wildlife, or the assessment of conflict levels, for example. And finally, I'm going to go into just a brief description of how it might apply to some of our connectivity and our wildlife management. So the map on the right shows the Calgary's draft ecological network that's composed of our biodiversity cores and stepping stone habitats, primary and secondary corridors. We use models like this to help us aid in identifying connection potential for new parks coming into city inventory through development, and to help us set priorities for restoration in existing parks. Most of the data that informs this map is based on landscape structure, or the natural environment parks, where they're located, and the diversity and health of habitats they contain. The data that's generated by the Calgary Captured program will help us determine how well we're doing in terms of conserving and managing habitat for wild species, because we currently don't really have a way to monitor that. This provides a big piece of evidence to help us better understand that. And it'll help us by answering those questions that I highlighted earlier. Some of our management goals are to support and refine the connectivity model that's developed, so it will help us prioritize our corridors within the city, or inform mitigation and restoration opportunities within the city. So to close, I'd just like to say that Calgary Captured is a really special program to the city. It allows us to peer into our natural parks and glimpse at the wildlife we coexist with. And through the program, we're able to offer a unique way for Calgarians to engage with and learn about their wild neighbors, while at the same time providing valuable data that will help inform ecological planning and management within the city. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to log on to the site, zooniverse.org, and help us start classifying. Just a quick nod to our partners and funders again. As Nicole said, this program wouldn't be possible without this excellent team. Thank you. And question?
Okay. Let me start going through some of these questions. I got a few in the Q&A section, so I'm not sure if everyone can see them, but the first was, can organizations access the data? And yes, we are planning for this data to be openly available. Sorry, Lynette, you're finished with your presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not sure that last slide snuck in there.
Okay. Here, I want to just put up the
that sounds
a slide that shows where people can find our
perfect.
Webinars. So they're looking at something. So yeah, sorry. Organizations will be able to access data. As I said, that there is quite a time lag. So once that we have the data cleaned and ready, we're happy to share that with anyone who's interested. And then there's another question about vandalism and theft. So yes, it's an issue here. And then they asked about any design recommendation for securing cameras. And so we use, we do have, most of our cameras have security boxes, but we do have some cameras that don't have security boxes, but they are all locked to a tree. So we use a thick cable lock, a master lock. They, with big enough bolt cutters, anybody's going to be able to break through those locks, but we've had some success with these master lock ones that are quite thick, and it prevents people from opening the camera and then removing it from the tree. Of course, aside, we do from time to time still get people with bolt cutters, but that is, I think, just a risk that you have to prepare for. And then, I guess one more thing I'll note about that is that we have not placed cameras on big bike trails, paved trails, like the heaviest use trails. And that's not because wildlife won't use those, wildlife will be, but we initially did not place them on those because of the time it took to go through those human images. There's just too many people using it. But that might be something you want to consider, is if you're worried about theft, not putting up cameras in some of those super high use areas. So I'm just going to scroll to the top. Dr. Lynn Morman at MRU on CBC last week mentioned photo mapping citizen science on wild turkeys. Do you work with her on any of this? No, we don't, and I'm actually not super familiar with that project. But it sounds really neat. You only talk about natural areas, but there's a lot of wildlife on city streets and yards. Is there anything about that? Yeah, so obviously the wildlife in Calgary is not just in our natural parks, but we are focusing on parks. I think we would kind of breach into some permitting and privacy issues if we varied outside of the city parks or the provincial park. So Lynette mentioned the 311 data that the city uses. So we do encourage people just to report their wildlife sightings to 311, and we can help keep track of it that way.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I mean, because the cameras have a date and time stamp, and the 311 phone-in or web submitted reports also have a date and time stamp, we can start to look at that data in conjunction with one another. And I think moose are a really good example. They're very large, and it's quite notable when they leave a habitat, or even when they're in a habitat you might expect them to be in. And you can literally, in a lot of the 311 data, see how they're moving through the neighborhoods by the timing of the way that the calls come in. So that's where we can use the verified species records from the Calgary Captured data and use it in combination with unverified records from 311 and get a bit of a better sense of some of that movement in areas, like Nicole said, where we can't really, because of permitting issues, put cameras up.
Then could you expand on the education programs based on Calgary Captured? Yeah, I mean, a bit. The Weaselhead Glenmore Preservation Society does student education programs at the Weaselhead Park. And they have developed kind of curriculums for different grade ranges that have wildlife coexistence messaging and just nature messaging in general. And then Friends of Fish Creek has the volunteer program with the camera crew, and they do various stewardship and kind of wildlife themed projects around Fish Creek.
And then if I can just add to that in a bit of an ad hoc way, we've had a few schools contact us to ask questions about Calgary Captured, and we've gone in and done presentations, and they have their students hop online and en masse sort of perform the classification through the Zooniverse website as part of their curriculum as well. So it's not a separate program per se, but they're incorporating it into their classrooms in some way, in some cases.
Yeah, I think that also kind of answers, somebody had a question about citizen science programs in classrooms.
Oh,
so yeah, that's definitely a way. And I think a couple people responded on checking out Inside Education. But Lynette, I know there is a school who set up their own wildlife camera. Do you want to mention that?
Yeah, we did get contacted by a school that was looking to place, they got I think it was an environmental grant. I can't remember from which organization. And they wanted to do a little bit of their own monitoring. They had a natural area that I think bordered the edge of the school site. And so they had initially reached out and asked for some information, and we got back in touch, and I provided them with some basic information. I never heard back from them. So I don't know if it was something that I think they had initially hoped to launch this year, but she said the fall was also an option. So that may be happening.
There was a question on the signage we use in these monitoring locations. I don't think we have any photos of them available right now, but the city of Calgary's the A-frame signs just notifies you that there's cameras in the area for wildlife research. And then on the actual cameras, we also have little tags that say wildlife research, let people know that human images are deleted immediately. And then that question, if people have further questions, they can see the website or even call 311. And how accurate have you found the citizen assessments to be? Have you noted a benefit in employing this type of crowdsourcing data for analysis compared to a single analyst expert reviewing the photos? So I haven't done a direct comparison. There is a lot of information in the literature on citizen science and quality control of that. And Miistakis has a lot of experience utilizing citizen science. We find it to be pretty accurate. The Canadian species that we're identifying aren't particularly difficult to identify. And because we have those 8 different people classify one image, we're confident on that quality. I mentioned the Zooniverse does take a while, so it does take longer than it probably would if we had a single expert going through the images. But I think that the quality control component kind of makes up for that. And there was recently a study published that showed that even experts would misclassify an image if they saw it more than once. So I think it's always beneficial to have that sort of quality control, whether you're using citizen scientists or an expert. Okay, how did the Calgary Captured program get started, and how was council involved, if at all? Do you want to take a stab at that, Lynette?
I was going to ask, I've only been with the program for about a year, so unfortunately I wasn't there to get it off the ground. And yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I don't believe council was directly involved, but I can tell you that the city does have a biodiversity, excuse me, a biodiversity advisory committee. Oh my gosh, it's a mouthful. And their role is to provide a bit of advice to what we're doing in terms of biodiversity, but also to report back to council on what we are doing in terms of biodiversity stewardship and providing those engagement opportunities. And so it may have been reported through them, but I'm not 100% sure. That's something, if you're interested, I could definitely find out the information and get back to you on.
Okay, what is the annual budget for the program? Camera replacement, operations, engagement, etc. So I don't have our budget in front of us, but I will say that a large portion of the budget is to cameras, especially initially. Cameras are very expensive. We have been able to find some more inexpensive cameras that we are comfortable with the quality of them. That has helped with that. And then, yeah, every year we do have to have, I think we have about $5,000 for camera replacement. And that, for things that are stolen or are not working and that sort of thing. Do you also provide reports to the public? The list of wildlife species will be useful to us, particularly within the Weaselhead Discovery Ridge areas. Yes, that is our intent. We don't, we're just getting that year of data, so we'll be able to, analyze that data, and we do intend to share the results with the public. And also, again, the data set will also be available to anyone who's interested. And then another question about the text on the signage, difficulty with FOIP and our legal services and drafting appropriate text. Sure, I can, I think I'll be able, yeah, I can get your email, Jocelyn, and share that with you, because I don't remember off the top of my head exactly what we say. I don't believe our text didn't on the signs, for the Calgary A-frame sign, I'm sure that had to go through some legal services.
Yes.
So yeah, so maybe Lynette and I can.
I can take you your information and get you some info on those signs. I may have a photo of it somewhere, but I would need to dig through a few folders to dig that up. It'll take me a little bit of time.
Okay. I can always take a photo of one.
Yeah.
Next time I'm out.
I'm pretty sure I have one somewhere in the bank of images.
Okay, we'll get that to you. Then do you use human observation data for park planning? Well, I guess I'll start off by just saying that we're interested in the park, or the human use of parks, because it'd be interesting to see if the high human use areas have an impact on wildlife. Maybe if we aren't seeing, maybe if we can tell that wildlife might be shifted to different times, or maybe shifted out of that area for an extended time after that high human use. We might be able to look at that if we also compare our data to maybe some non-urban parks or parks that have less human use than ours.
Yeah, right now I think a lot of our parks planning with respect to wildlife and human use happens more in a reactive way, right? But I think once we have 3 years of data from Calgary Captured, like you said, Nicole, we'll have a better understanding of the seasonal and the temporal partitioning, if there is any, and that'll be useful to figure out if and when we may need to do a little bit more sort of management in that area or change our approach.
Okay, I think, let me just check the Q&A again. I think we've addressed all of the questions. Just doing a quick scan. Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining us. Feel free to reach out to Lynette and I if you have any other questions.
Thanks so much, everybody, for attending. Thanks for your time.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.